Hello Internet, this is David, and welcome to the very first episode of David Talks About the Beatles.
Teach me something!
I will. So as many of you might know, my childhood obsession and the group that really got me into music, especially rock music, was the Beatles. I listened to their music extensively, obsessively. Just about everybody in the English-speaking world knows the Beatles' music, or at least knows who the Beatles were, knows that there was this band, the Beatles, that has become this gigantic cultural thing in our society. Why? Why did this rock-pop group from the 60s explode so massively, and why has their legacy lingered for so long? Well, I'm going to attempt to answer that in this first episode, which I have entitled Beatlemania. So if you're going to talk about a band, the way I see it, there are two ways to talk about them. One, either they have a really good individual or individuals who really excel at their respective instruments. You know, there's one soloist that everyone goes to see that band just to really see that one person. The other way is that the band really gels as a unit. Even if the individual performers aren't necessarily the best at their instruments, even if they aren't virtuosos, the unit, the way that the different members of the band play off of each other to create one thing, one performance, well, that's really special. In the case of the Beatles, I would argue that they had both. What you have to understand about the Beatles is that they started playing together when they were teenagers in the mid-50s. Now, this isn't a Beatles history legend, but what I want you to know is that they were together for a really long time before they got big, and they honed their skills playing in nightclubs and bars in Liverpool and the surrounding area, and even going to Hamburg, Germany for a tour. So by the time that they were finally discovered, they had really honed their skills on their respective instruments. So even if the Beatles weren't the best musicians in the entire world, they were still really good at their instruments, and they knew what it went into a good performance. So basically what I mean by this is that they were good as individual players, and they also gelled really well as a band. But wait a minute! Ringo wasn't even in the band when they got discovered. Their drummer at that point was Pete Best. Wasn't it? Wasn't it? Your entire argument is moot! Well, yes. Technically, Pete Best was their drummer at the time when they were discovered. But throughout their early career, playing in bars and nightclubs, Ringo Starr, who was in a different band, would sit in with them a lot of the times and jam with them informally. So even though he wasn't technically part of the group, he was still there a lot and was kind of their unofficial other drummer. Shortly after joining Brian Epstein, the Beatles released their first hit single, Please Please Me, and because they had been a stage act for so long, they were able to record their first album, also called Please Please Me, in one day. One day. Listen to that album again. A lot of what you hear are first and only takes of those songs. I mean, is it really any wonder they exploded? My other question was, why does their legacy endure? Why do people still remember and talk about the Beatles so much? It's simple. Every musician who has come after has owed something to the Beatles. The Beatles were one of the first groups to break away from the 1-4-5 rock and roll blues structure and start implementing minor chords and different musical elements into their songwriting. They were also one of the first rock groups to use more introspective lyrics. The Beatles were one of the first groups to introduce sort of surrealist and hippie elements into their music. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band has been called the first concept album. And lest we forget, the Beatles were the first people to use feedback. They invented feedback in music. They introduced feedback into music. They invented Jimi Hendrix. So that is a brief summation of why the Beatles exploded and became the mega ultra superstars that they did, and why their legacy has continued to this day. Thank you very much, and I will see you guys here next time. Bye-bye.